So now we're on to the Fabaceae, which is a super important family globally and also in Australia, one of the most diverse families in all of flowering plants. And so it's really important to get a good grasp on this one. About 12,000 species globally. So I think it's the third biggest family after Asteraceae and the orchids globally. Super important for agriculture, and lots of native Australian species, some of which are threatened, some of which are super common. So it's actually really easy to identify these species if and only if you find the fruits. And so the fruits are these dehiscent fruits, often dry, but they split along two sides. And this was mentioned a little bit by David Keith in his earlier lecture. And this is really characteristic. So you would call it a pod. And that's, or a legume is the technical term, which is also the name of the family. And if you see this, you know you're in the Fabaceae. And that's kind of the end of the story. But you don't always have fruits around, so we'll go on to some more different characters. So there are two subfamilies that are common in Australia with very different flowers. And so we'll go through those in a second. Both of those subfamilies have extremely similar fruits. Both have these legume-style fruits. So different flowers, same fruits. This family is really fascinating in terms of evolution and in terms of symbioses. So the nitrogen-fixing symbioses in root nodules is common, not in every species, but in sort of 90% of species in this family. And we'll have a whole lab on this later on in the term. So really good at symbioses. And symbioses with ants are also really common and really fascinating. So they make friends really well. So Fabaceae makes friends with other creatures, other organisms, and other kingdoms really well, which is also a really interesting pattern. So there are two different subfamilies. We don't need to worry about the names. We'll call one the pea subfamily. And it has pea-type flowers. Often compound, alternate leaves. Not always compound, but often. So and that can be in two different types. So one is this kind of pinnate compound leaf, which you can see here. From the locust tree. Lots of leaflets there. The other type that's really common is trifoliate. So basically the same thing, but only 3 leaflets. And that is very common, especially among herbaceous species. So yeah, herbaceous species, tree species, lots of different growth forms, lots of vines in this family. So every single growth form has members of the Fabaceae. Then the flowers themselves have this what we call zygomorphic or bilaterally symmetric appearance. They call it irregular flowers here, so not radially symmetric, bilaterally symmetry. And then they have come up with, it's so important, they've come up with actually special names for the types of this flower. There's this bottom bit, which is really characteristic, which is called the keel in this family. Then a couple things beside it, which are wings, and then these big things that look kind of like ears, big crazy ears, which are called banners. And so this pea-type flower, you'll get it pretty easily, and you can start to recognize it over and over again. There's a certain similarity to orchids, which we'll get to later, but again, other characteristics should distinguish it between being a Fabaceae versus being an orchidaceae. So that's the pea-type flowers. The common one you'll see all over the gardens is wisteria, so have a really close look at these. Tear apart a couple flowers, make sure you can find the keel and the banners, and figure out the leaf arrangement as well is very characteristic for Fabaceae. There are also many common native ones around Sydney. Often a lot of these little yellow peas. So this is something you'll see when you go for bushwalks in the national parks. And they're not the easiest to identify, but there's many of them, and you can get them with a little bit of effort, especially if you use Robinson. I would recommend not trying to use the key on PlantNet for these species because it's really difficult, and use the field guide for this group. The other area that's super common to find Fabaceae are introduced weeds. So these ones for the iNaturalist collection, you want to focus on the native ones again, but there's many weeds which are appropriate to collect for the weed collection. This is a clover. In this case, the little Pea-type flowers, there are many of them, and they're compressed into a very dense inflorescence, kind of head-type inflorescence. But if you tear these apart, they have that same structure that you see in the wisteria flowers. So you can find Fabaceae in many lawns, and it'll be relatively easy for pretty much typically everyone in the plant collection comes in for the weed collection, has one member of the Fabaceae in their collection. So I don't expect this year to be different. So that's the pea subfamily. The other big subfamily that's really important in Australia is the wattle. We'll call it the wattle-type flower or the wattle subfamily. And very different, again, the fruits are the same, but very different floral structures. So much more reminiscent of Myrtaceae here because the stamens are actually very showy, and you get this kind of very pom-pom type appearance. Here are, should be able to tell it relatively easily, the lack of a smell. So there have been a few cases where people have mixed up Myrtaceae and Fabaceae, but the key characteristic is always look for that smell, the resin dots and the smell of Myrtaceae when you're looking at the leaves. And the flowers are slightly different if you actually tear them apart and start to look at the structure within there, although in this case you can't really see it because the stamens are so showy. A couple notes about IDing wattles. It's not that easy, but it is doable. The leaves themselves are not true leaves, so they're not like these in some wattles. So there's two types of wattles. There's ones that have these typical leaves that are more like this, pinnate or bipinnate. But more common around Sydney are these ones that have phyllodes. So phyllodes are not actually leaves at all. They're modified stems, and a bit weird, but in the sense that they look like simple leaves, but they actually don't have buds at the base. They're not anatomically from the same origin as the bipinnate leaves. So that is something to know about. In the Keys, they're a bit kind of woodier, thicker looking compared to what you might think of as normal leaves. Wattle leaves are not true leaves. They're modified phyllodes. There often are extrafloral nectaries, which are for this kind of symbiosis with ants. Sometimes they're on the leaves, the base of the leaf, especially in many species of wattle. And some of them are working, some of them are not working. And so sometimes the relationship with ants is strong, sometimes it's less strong. But the location of these is often very useful for IDing wattles. Also some other Fabaceae groups, but especially wattles. And it's tough, but it is doable. So stick with it if you're having issues.